All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Hess III. I am an independent consultant based in Phoenix, Arizona. And today we are here to discuss part of our prevention series following the strategic prevention framework. Today's topic is going to be planning for implementation and evaluation. And we're going to be doing some really heavy overtones around how we incorporate prevention into strategic planning and into our evaluation preparation work. So for those of you that have participated in previous sessions, again, I'm not going to belabor my biography for you, but you should have a copy of this PowerPoint available. Lorraine will be able to send that out if she's not already, for you to get a little bit more familiar with myself as the presenter, roughly or in brief, I have 15 years of experience in the health and human services industry, many of which have involved prevention on a number of different levels, working both here in Arizona. I've been working with the University of Arkansas at Little Rock now for, I believe, going on 5 years, providing technical assistance and training opportunities. So I've been able to become pretty familiar with the layout and the landscape. And then I have done some national work with SAMHSA and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and a couple of other national and or federal organizations related to prevention work, coalition building, and community-based behavioral health or health and human services activities. I'm going to skip this slide largely. The only thing that's really salient is that our expertise really is in the domains that cross over into prevention. And so everything from fund development and sustainability work to strategy and all those things. And so I believe that's why UALR keeps using me and the organization, because this is definitely in perfect alignment with where our strengths are as an entity. And so for today, what we're going to be covering is a number of different things. And like I said, we're going to have some really heavy overtones in today's discussion around what this looks like for prevention specifically. So for those of you that may have participated in other workshops or trainings or even webinars related to strategic planning or evaluation, hopefully today's lens will be unique in that our focus is going to be within the prevention world and what this looks like. And so we will start by kind of connecting the dots to other phases of the strategic prevention framework, specifically capacity building, which happens before your planning phase on the strategic prevention framework. And we'll talk through strategies for facilitation, common sense methods for documenting your strategies, and of course, approaches for using your tool, using your strategic plan as a tool for evaluation, as well as incorporating your evaluation component into your planning efforts. So there's lots of layers and lenses we're going to be folding in today. So as I mentioned, we're going to pick up exactly where we've left off in previous training. So if you've not participated in previous workshops or webinars, please reach out to Lorraine. We were able to record those as well as have the PowerPoints available in PDF for you, so you can get some of that content even if you weren't able to join us live. And so, as you know, the strategic prevention framework is an evidence-based process model focused and proven effective for community-based substance abuse prevention, specifically focusing on youth, but it's been adapted for a number of different populations. And so it starts with the assessment, and then it moves into capacity building, and then it focuses on your planning activities, and then of course implementation and evaluation. So we're building the bridge between what happens in capacity building and how we move from capacity building into your strategic planning. So as we've described in previous sessions, capacity building entails all the activities to ensure the organization has the tools and resources needed to do the job. And these tools and resources include knowledge, skills, and abilities. So they're tangible as well as intangible resources. And what's important is that before we walk into strategic planning, where we're really going to make decisions around the types of activities and work we're going to be doing over the next coming year or 3 years or 5 years, depending on the term of your strategic plan, we really want to make sure that we have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to inform strategic planning. And so prior to strategic planning, it is absolutely imperative that we review and visit the needs assessment. Of course, if you just completed the needs assessment within the last couple of weeks or even months, I'm sure you're intimately familiar with it. But if you did your needs assessment 3 years ago, it may be a good opportunity for you to take some time to revisit the document, identify if any updates or additional research needs to be done, to make sure that it is reflective of the current status of your community in which you're working. Of course, that doesn't imply you go do a full new needs assessment, but you may want to look back at what in project management we call your organizational process assets. But looking back at the documentation of your progress, maybe the evaluations of your last year's strategic plan, if you've met all your goals, what the outcomes may be. I have worked with several coalitions that have been very, very successful, when targeting specific neighborhoods and specifically addressing underage drinking. They were so successful that underage drinking actually was no longer a problem in their community because they had succeeded in their strategies. And so when they went to go renew their strategic plan for the year, they really had to revisit the progress that they'd made and where the needs existed in the community. And of course, they ended up doing another full needs assessment, but I use that as an example just to say, hopefully there has been some change. So it's important that that needs assessment is incorporated into the strategic planning process. Based off of that needs assessment, and again, this really talks about the capacity building work that we discussed in previous sessions, looking at evidence-based practices and strategies that have been identified to address the needs that your community is seeking. So if we're talking about, tobacco use, or if we're talking about prescription drug use, or we're talking about suicide, or whatever the targeted issues are that are faced by your community, part of that capacity building process is going to be researching the evidence-based practices that are proven or that have shown evidence to positively prevent or make an impact in addressing those needs. And I hope I'm aligning these pieces together well enough for you to be able to say or be able to see that you really want to walk into strategic planning with a highly knowledgeable group of people. The people that are participating, whether it's from your coalition or stakeholders or funders, you want to make sure that all of them have been oriented to both the needs that were identified in your needs assessment, as well as the evidence-based strategies and practices that are known to be effective for that community or for that targeted issue. Because that is how you're able to have a really strong and impactful strategic planning session, is when people are fully briefed and oriented to what the issues are and what the known solutions are, so that when you walk in there, you're not just shooting in the dark, strategies and ideas. And I have worked with organizations that really have struggled with strategic planning because the knowledge base of the people that were participating in the strategic planning session was all over the place. Some people were highly specialized in pharmaceutical comorbid conditions for adolescents experiencing behavioral health issues, and then you have a foster mom who has no professional training whatsoever in behavioral health or substance use or anything at all, but it's just very passionate. And then you have someone's grandma who's been raising their 3 children or their 3 grandchildren, and the diversity of the group, the knowledge base was so disparate that it was very difficult to get the team to meet consensus because they weren't familiar, again, with what the needs assessment had found, as well as with what evidence has shown already works to address the issues. And of course, the point of that is to really leverage the known research and or promising practices. Of course, we don't want to be uh, uh, strictly limited to evidence-based practices, but even promising approaches or innovative practices that are based on evidence or inspired by evidence-based practices but adapted for your community. Those are also great things to really help you leverage research to inform your strategy development. And so a couple of strategies, and again, I wanted to just kind of include these in here just as opportunities if you're not familiar with them. I wanted to make sure that we reviewed them at least from a very high level, and ironically, these are very high level strategies. So one thing that we know is very effective for substance abuse prevention, especially community-based prevention, and again, it's not just substances, but also suicide and other issues, but are looking at environmental strategies. So environmental strategies are focused on supply and demand for substances or whatever kind of the targeted issues may be. And so these are specific to alcohol, tobacco, and prescription drugs. But these are examples of the types of strategies that have been shown effective at really preventing substance use within targeted communities. So some coalitions across the country have been successful at adding taxes to alcohol, so thereby by making alcohol more expensive, people are less likely to purchase it at the store because it becomes more costly, and that is a proven strategy. Working with the city to identify restrictions on liquor store density. So this intersection or this corner or this block already has 4 liquor stores. We don't need another one because, of course, by creating greater access to liquor, people are going to access it more frequently. If it's easy to get, if you have to drive across town or 30 minutes away to go to the liquor store, you're less likely to do that. Responsible server training, so at bars and restaurants, making sure that people are not over pouring, making sure that they're familiar with the liquor laws within your particular community, whether that has to do with the age of or like checking people's IDs, of course, any time limitations, making sure they're not pouring or serving past certain time restrictions, but all different things. In Arizona, which again is where I'm based, we have some of the strictest liquor laws in the country. And so there are very specific rules around how many servings of alcohol you're allowed to serve someone in a setting. If someone were to leave a bar or a liquor establishment and get into a car accident, that establishment can actually be held accountable and sued for any damages, or unfortunately, if there were to be a loss of life, that bar or restaurant could be held accountable as well. So responsible server training would encompass all the local laws, and that's going to be specific to your community. Mandatory warning labels. Of course, we see these on like cigarettes, and they are on a lot of liquor bottles these days, but there can be stricter rules and community or specific rules. Prescription drug drop boxes, which again is really aimed at reducing the supply of prescription drugs. So individuals, you get injured or you have surgery, they prescribe you 10 types of pain pills, you only use a fraction of them, and you leave the rest of your pills sitting in your cabinet, and your children, nephews, nieces, grandkids, neighbors, the plumber, whomever it is able to access those because they're literally just sitting around, and you're not paying attention to how many pills there are, if they're still in the cabinet, because you're not actively taking them. So by getting prescription drugs off the streets, there's been again, reducing access or the supply of prescription drugs is proven effective at reducing people's use of prescription drugs. Random checkpoints, we see this a lot around holidays where the police or sheriff or other law enforcement will do checkpoints. Zoning and building codes discourage drug activity. And there's another one that 2 down where it says increased lighting and line of sight in public spaces and parks. So in areas where we know or that are known for high drug or crime activity, there are a lot of public administration or municipal approaches that have been found effective at really eliminating or reducing traffic in those areas, and of course helping to turn around communities. And there's some really interesting approaches, things as simple as, again, increasing lighting, removing blind spots by cutting back and hemming bushes and things like that to eliminate or reduce the amount of shadows in which drug sellers are able to operate. Things, as simple as stop signs and block watch programs, and even I worked in one community where they rerouted the number of access points into their community so that it was harder for people to simply drive through the neighborhood, cruising, so to speak, for drug clients. Lots of interesting things that have been and can be done from a public administration or municipal level. And of course, your city government would be somewhat knowledgeable of those. And again, there's lots of research and literature around what works and what doesn't. But even increasing, off-duty police officer surveillance or on-duty police officer surveillance in those high-risk public areas. So again, you get more patrol officers on the streets. I am very familiar. It's actually quite common, for prevention coalitions to use some of their funding to hire off-duty police officers and pay the salaries to help increase patrol in targeted neighborhoods. Now, of course, those are coalitions that receive large amounts of funding from different resources, and then, of course, work closely with their local law enforcement to arrange agreements and contracts to make that sustainable and feasible. But there is a lot of evidence, again, around simply having increased police presence or law enforcement presence does reduce substance use. Secret shopper programs, curfews for underage minors. Again, I don't want to belabor some of these points, but I did want to make sure that we reviewed them because this is exactly what you would want to be doing with your coalition in advance of strategic planning. I'm going to ask folks to type something in the chat box for me. In this review that we just did, it's a very cursory, high-level review, but how many people learned something new about one of these strategies, or maybe you had never heard of the strategy before? If you'll type yes in the chat box, or if you want to comment on what the strategy was, but a simple Y in the chat box will let me know that you heard something you'd never heard of before. Yeah, I see. So it looks like just about everyone, one of these strategies was something new or was a different approach. And so having now heard these strategies, if we were about to walk into strategic planning right now and talk about underage drinking within our specific neighborhood or county, this group, having now been educated on some of these, would have a bigger tool belt or toolbox to be able to pull ideas from. And maybe we're not able to fund necessarily hiring of off-duty police officers because that can get very expensive. So maybe that's not sustainable for us, but we could create again, a neighborhood block watch program where we have volunteers that commit to patrolling a neighborhood for free. And of course, they build a relationship with the local police. And so financially, it's modeled after this increased surveillance, but due to funding, we don't actually use police officers, but we use volunteers from the neighborhood. That would be an example of how this knowledge of these evidence-based strategies or environmental strategies would help inform strategic planning. I do want to make a quick note. I sent over a PDF to Lorraine that is strictly about environmental strategies. It was developed a couple of years ago, and it's something that I have used heavily throughout my work with various coalitions. So I want to make sure that that handout gets out to everyone because it is really, really helpful. It's short and sweet. I think it's about 30 pages just around environmental strategies, and it gives you a checklist, which is where a lot of these strategies are pulled from. for you to kind of look at and consider different opportunities. And of course, there's lots of other opportunities out there. Okay, so now, again, we've kind of focused on incorporating prevention into planning, where we've kind of laid the groundwork of, okay, we're about to walk into strategic planning. What should have happened prior to strategic planning? And that was kind of what the activity that we just did was, making sure that everyone who's participating in strategic planning is super knowledgeable about the needs in our community, as well as knowledgeable about the evidence-based strategies that work to address some of those needs. So some of the slides as we go into strategic planning, they're far too detailed for what we need to cover today, so I may move pretty quickly through some of them. But when planning, when facilitating strategic planning, you really want to identify the key participants and stakeholders that need to be present. So if for whatever reason, or if, for example, your coalition uses a board president structure and has a president and a vice president, a secretary and a treasurer, and your vice president is not able to participate, but they're highly influential in the work, of course, you may want to reschedule strategic planning around them. And I know that that sounds a little obvious, but also centered around your stakeholders. If, for example, you feel like, you're really headed towards a increased surveillance activity or strategy, and you want to build a relationship with the police department, maybe the chief of police hasn't participated in a coalition yet, but you would really love them to participate in a strategic planning session, really thinking strategically around who needs to be in the room. Of course, as you can see here at the bottom, schedule a pre-strategic planning level setting meeting. So again, that's where you're going to get that cohort of people that's going to participate, whether that be your whole coalition, your entire organization, or just a selected executive board or whatever that group is. But you really want to get that team together and spend the time to walk them through the key points of your needs assessment and the known evidence-based strategies that inform or address the needs that your community has, because that gives everyone the baseline of knowledge to then allow for creativity. And that is really, really critical because I think I've belabored that point, but do the prep work before strategic planning. So at your level setting meeting, again, you want to agree on an objective. If you're able to have a third party facilitate, that's always ideal. It eliminates the bias of any or perceived bias of any participant or member. Of course, you want to make sure this team knows your history, mission, vision, and values. Thoroughly understand any regulatory or contractual requirements. So if your funding has any restrictions on it, you want to make sure you cover those. And like I said already, review your needs assessment with the group. Of course, identify when strategic planning will happen, so make sure it's a convenient location. You can use teleconferencing in strategic planning or video conferencing if you want to. It definitely makes things a little bit more challenging because you're not able to read the room so well, and the facilitator may struggle a little bit more to be able to know kind of where people are at. But some organizations or groups are, it's just not feasible to get everyone physically in the same building at the same time. And so you want to make sure that those needs are considered. Look at a schedule, scheduling breaks, all that stuff is really important. Consider food if you're going to have it. I'm a big, big fan personally of allowing people multiple modalities to participate. And so if we were sitting in the room physically together right now, everyone would have, a pad of paper, some Post-it notes, there'd be flip chart paper up on the wall, and everyone would have access to markers. So that if you had an aha moment, you can get up on the flip chart paper and write something down. If you had a question, you can scribble it down, on a note card or a Post-it note. Or if you're just taking notes for yourself, you can use your pad of paper. Of course, raise your hand, verbally get up, walk around the room, those types of things, because it's really important for folks to be able to contribute. And even be able to contribute anonymously. Sometimes priorities or decisions can be tense or difficult, or maybe someone doesn't want to openly share a particular idea or critique of an idea. And so, again, using note cards, put a box in the middle of the room, or ask everyone, to jot down their ideas on note cards and collect them from everyone. So again, it is anonymous. And of course, as you go through your day, depending on how much time you're spending, planning mental breaks, role playing, physical activity, and movement. I have participated in strategic planning that lasted 5 days. In our world and environment, I think that's probably a little robust or too robust. I think that for our coalitions, being able to spend 2 to 4 hours on strategic planning is probably more than enough. But it's really dependent on your group and what you guys are aiming to do and where you're at in your development. Again, how structured or skilled the facilitator is. But even in a 4-hour day, you're going to need to take some breaks. And so make sure that you plan for those so that people aren't becoming uncomfortable and cranky. One thing I also like to do, and you'll see this as the hint here on the left, is for people that either have not been invited or are unable to attend strategic planning in person, is, for example, notify the coalition a couple weeks ahead of time. Hey, we're entering into strategic planning. We recognize not everyone will be able to participate live when it's happening. So, if you have any thoughts or feedback or anything that you feel is very important for us to consider, please shoot us an email, fill out this SurveyMonkey link, pull us aside and let us know so that you're able to really incorporate all of the voices of people that are actively participating in your committee. Especially with stakeholders, I found this to be effective. If they're not super highly engaged, having a 15-minute phone call with them ahead of time before strategic planning to say, hey, Chief of Police, how do you feel about increased surveillance in this neighborhood? Is it within your budget? Would we need to raise money for it? If we feel like that's an idea that we're going to explore during strategic planning, it's totally okay to have some conversations ahead of time so that when you're in the room doing strategic planning, if the chief of police is like, hell no, absolutely not, we're not doing that, then you don't write a strategic plan that says we're going to have the police increase surveillance, only later to find out that there's no way it's going to work out. So, again, the prep work before strategic planning is really, really critical and will really pay off in the long run. So whether that be, again, through the coalition members all submitting some feedback ahead of time, or having those one-off conversations with the key stakeholders, because we know, that underage drinking is a really significant problem at, the Friday night football games, and the school doesn't have any personnel to monitor, students drinking on campus at the football game. So, we want to engage the law enforcement. So while facilitating strategic planning, and some of these, again, I'm going to move through pretty quickly. Facilitation is a skill, and more than a skill, it's an art. And so for those of you that have done facilitation, you already know that. For those of you that are interested in becoming a facilitator or facilitating these types of sessions, the role and function of a facilitator really is as an observer. Really, it's focused on listening, not talking, engaging, and really asking the questions to solicit information. So this is why having a third-party facilitator is really helpful, because you don't want the facilitator, and as a facilitator, you do not want to contribute anything to the process. You really just want to draw it out of people and capture the information and document it. And so we do that through open-ended questions, multiple choice questions, acknowledging and allowing respectful disagreement and conflict. If there is a disagreement in strategy, it's not a matter of deciding who's right and who's wrong, but it's a matter of exploring the 2 opinions or the 3 opinions or the 4 opinions or the 12 opinions, and allowing all of that to come to the table and then navigating it to a place where it doesn't disrupt the process, and also allowing it to be constructive. And so there's a number of skills and tools. There's some really great um, tools or books and types of trainings that you can go through to learn how to be an effective facilitator. And unfortunately, today we're not able to go through that full in depth. Maybe if and when I'm in person out in Arkansas, we'll be able to walk through some of that. But so I wanted to pause for a moment, and this may take a little bit more typing, so get your fingers ready. But for those of you that have done facilitation or have participated in strategic planning, what are some of the strategies that you have found or have used that are most effective? And so whether that be conflict resolution, or even just, trying to get a team to engage in a meeting. Again, we talked through some of the open-ended questions, we talked through multiple choice questions, but does anyone have any additional strategies or things that you've used or found effective at helping to draw information out of people? Go ahead and type your answers in the chat box. And I'm going to hope for at least one. There we go. Thank you, Teresa. Motivational interviewing is fantastic. For those of you that are not familiar with motivational interviewing, it's actually a clinical tool, but it is all about it's a evidence-based clinical tool that really utilizes some of the strategies that we've talked about so far, but open-ended questions, focusing on strengths, really engaging members based off of their previous experience and successes. So if you encounter a roadblock, have you ever encountered a situation like this before? What happened then? What skills or tools did you use to overcome that experience? Do you feel like you can use those skills and tools again this time around? What may be different? It's really about unearthing people's motivation. Why are you here today? What empowers you or makes you interested in participating in this coalition? And for those of you or those individuals that are formally trained in motivational interviewing can do this a lot better than I can. But that's an excellent example. Thank you, Teresa, for sharing that. And so, yes, and Chuck, so trying to level set or get some agreement on objectives prior to strategic planning, absolutely. And I think we talked about that in one of the previous slides. Sometimes that in and of itself becomes the conflict. What are the objectives going to be? And so, again, in the perfect world, you should be able to walk into a 2 to 4 hour session, talk about your needs assessment, talk about the evidence basis of that assessment, review your mission vision, previous strategic plans, know where you've been, and then punch out exactly where you're going to go for this year. But in the real world, or the reality of this, maybe you have a session and you literally just get to what the objectives for strategic planning should be. And you realize, okay, well, we're going to take this a little bit slower, and we're going to have 3 sessions and walk through this one by one. And Chuck, as you said, sometimes identifying those objectives is the perfect place to start. And whatever that process looks like, sometimes even that becomes the area of conflict. And so having, again, that skilled facilitator is really helpful. General rules of the road or rules of thumb, one of my professors used to say this all of the time: keep it simple, silly. He liked to say, keep it simple, stupid. But I've lightened that up a little bit. But really, we don't have to save the world today. We don't have to solve all of the, global hunger today. What is the low-hanging fruit in our approach and in our community? Where can we win? And focusing on those wins, because as we accumulate or amount a number of small wins, they add up to a bigger and larger win. When facilitating strategic planning, I always provide opportunity for chaos. It's going to happen. People are going to come up with wonderfully wild ideas. I think if we just passed out ice cream cones to all of the children of the world, then they wouldn't want to smoke marijuana because they'd be eating ice cream. All right, that is an idea. That is definitely an idea. And so you never want to discredit an idea. And so that's something we would write on the parking lot: ice cream cones for substance abuse prevention. And we would, it's important, and there's actually some legitimate strategy behind this. People really need the validation of seeing their ideas captured. And so as a facilitator, even the most wild ideas, or things that may be really complicated and not well teased out, or things that people are absolutely against. If someone said ice cream cones for substance abuse prevention and the room was just like, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard, there's no way in hell that's going to work. Um, you know, it's still important to capture it, to validate the people in the room, to acknowledge the fact that the conversation happened, and maybe ice cream cones for substance abuse prevention isn't an evidence-based strategy, and it's not where we end up landing. At least we've affirmed that member, and they can stay engaged in the process and engaged in the group. And maybe we decide, maybe we're not going to pass out ice cream cones, but maybe we're going to wrap the ice cream truck and use their loudspeaker to send out PSAs while they're delivering ice cream. I don't know. It may come out to a legitimate strategy. And it's amazing how that happens. So you want to always document people's comments. To validate their experience, to validate their input in the process, and also to allow it to sit there and allow people to chew on it for a little bit, because something good may come of it, and it is remarkable how that happens. Doing a deep dive, what we mean by that is, someone says ice cream cones for substance abuse prevention. Okay, well, tell me more about that. What does that mean? Like, what does that look like? How does that tie back to the evidence-based strategies we've talked about? How is that, tell me more about what you're thinking around how this may be an evidence-based strategy or an environmental strategy. Because sometimes people just aren't the greatest at articulating their ideas, or they haven't fleshed them out enough. So we start sitting here and talking about ice cream cones, and maybe we land on engaging. Actually, this would be a good example. So when I was in elementary school, my kindergarten teacher, her family owned a very prominent local ice cream company. It's called Ruggles Ice Cream, and it's in Ohio. And so, maybe we needed to engage Mrs. Ruggles, and maybe their company, becomes a large sponsor, of our coalition and our campaign. And they decide, that for an entire year, they're going to put, a label on all of their ice cream that gets sold locally at all the major grocery stores in town, that describes our a really important, prevention campaign. And so there and again, ice cream cones for substance abuse prevention has become public education and awareness, which is an evidence-based strategy. And so again, by using deep dives as a facilitator to allow people to kind of verbally process and talk through what they're thinking, you may actually end up with some strategies that work. And as other folks in the room are able to contribute to that idea and that concept, it may take on a whole new life. So sometimes these two strategies are totally opposite of one another. Sometimes you just write it up on the parking lot because it's a placeholder and you don't move on any further. It could be a tangent and it will derail you for 6 hours, and you just want to write it down and capture it, and then you need to keep moving on. But other times there's a level of interest, and that's when you use the deep dive. If it's curious and it sounds like it can work, it just needs some development, that's when we deep dive. So we parking lot to kind of place hold and move on, and we deep dive to explore and be able to tease it out a little bit further to identify if it's a good match. And other things you may deep dive to, and we see this on the right, just a little comment, is identifying who the stakeholder is that may help spearhead that. So in my ice cream analogy, I need Mrs. Ruggles and her family's ice cream company. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. And who has a relationship with Mrs. Ruggles? And of course, to help identify the priorities that can be helped. So looking at the structure, you're going to recognize this. This is the same template that we utilized in our logic models recommendation last week or 2 weeks ago when we did that presentation. And again, that's because I personally recommend that you try to streamline the various documents that you use. And so in a strategic plan, you almost always have your goal, and you really want to, what I have found is that to be effective, you want to, especially in a volunteer-based community coalition, really limit the number of goals you have to no more than 3. Because if you have 10, there's no way you're going to accomplish it. And it's likely that many of the 10 goals probably could be rolled up into 3 or 4 maximum, but even 2 or 3 that you can really focus on and be really successful in. So this is about being really targeted and very successful and not spreading yourself so thin that you're not able to accomplish anything. Again, we talk through your activities. So if the goal is education and awareness campaign via, create a public-private partnership with Ruggles Ice Cream to roll out an education and awareness campaign. The activities, so what are the steps you're going to do to meet that goal? So we're going to contact Mrs. Ruggles. Well, we're going to develop a proposal. We're going to contact Mrs. Ruggles. We're going to develop the education and awareness campaign language and verbiage that we're going to use. They're going to roll it out, and then we're going to receive 5 cents for every pint of ice cream that gets sold, or whatever that may be, whatever the relationship looks like. Like I said, the person responsible, the inputs, this goes back to our logic model conversation from a couple weeks ago related to what exactly goes into it. So of course, maybe you need to hire a branding and marketing consultant to help you design your messaging around this campaign. Of course, Ruggles Ice Cream needs to donate the label space or whatever that's going to be, and all the other resources that go into that. Your person responsible, your due dates, your current progress, again, is kind of your project management side of this. You're able to see, maybe we've outreached to Mrs. Ruggles twice and not received a response. So you're able to know exactly what's happened. And then your outcomes of this type of campaign, they printed 10,000 pints of ice cream with our targeted educational messaging. So that's really an output. And then the outcome would be increased, knowledge or education, direct messaging contact with 10,000 people. Maybe that leads to people going to the website, or maybe that leads to, some other, whatever the engagement is that you're making into that progress. And in this relationship, we've talked about a sponsorship piece. So maybe you get a check for $10,000 as well, because they donated 5 cents for every pint of ice cream they sold. You can kind of blend those however you would like to. And so the goal is that while you're facilitating, I have never in my career, and I have facilitated dozens of organizational as well as coalition level strategic plans. Never in my career have I walked out of a strategic planning session with a fully documented, finalized, nicely typed up and printed out strategic plan. I normally walk out of a strategic planning session with a stack of flip chart paper, a bunch of note cards, maybe an audio recording, a bunch of pens, and leftover cookies and diet soda, and it's just kind of a cluster. It all goes into my car. I get home, I throw it all up on the walls. I throw the flip chart paper, stick it back up on my walls, wallpaper my entire room with it, and then I start documenting it and organizing it into the plan. So the goal is not to walk out of the room with a tightly documented and signed off of document. The goal is to walk out with the content you will use to populate the document. Of course, if you're able to get to the point of, okay, here's our goal and here are the activities underneath the goal, create a number system, goal number 1, and then activity 1.1, because it aligns with goal number 1, activity 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, so on and so forth. But really, the facilitated strategic planning session is just about getting the content. Then you go home, one person types it up, you send it back out to the committee or the participants and say, hey, did I miss anything? Can you edit this, track changes, whatever we need to do? I'm going to recommend at this point that we revisit our keep it simple, because what happens at this point is people start wordsmithing and really kind of killing the language. Like I can't tell you how many hours I've spent with people over wordsmithing this document, this strategic plan, because it has to be perfect. Those personalities and those people are definitely out there, and of course language is very important, but the most critical thing is not what the piece of paper says. The most critical part is the work that gets done because of what the piece of paper says. And so as you're documenting and working with your coalitions, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you really stress a pragmatic approach to the content, and that people are comfortable with the meat that is behind the words and the meaning of the words versus the words themselves. And I promise you, this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, because I've never encountered a group that did not enjoy wordsmithing their strategic plan to death. So good luck with that. And I think, again, you can only reinforce the need to focus on the work that will come out of those words and not the words themselves. And hopefully your team will be really helpful or realize the importance of that. We kind of already went through the elements of this document in our logic models training last week, so I'm going to skip this slide, but this is just a description of each of those components that we just reviewed. Operationalizing your goals, again, we talked about this as well in our training last week to an extent. So, you want to take the goals and really operationalize the activities into tangibly what does this look like. So our ice cream educational and marketing campaign, of course, we need to develop a proposal. We need to engage Mrs. Ruggles. We need to create a contract. We need to hire a consultant to develop the messaging. We need to get, any graphics or imaging over to Ruggles Ice Cream Company to print on their new label. Maybe they're going to ask us to approve the new label if they are so kind to do that. We need to respond to all of the emails and social media hits and everything that comes out from this marketing campaign. And of course, we need to collect a big fat check at the end of that, hopefully. And so here is another example of what this looks like completed. You can see the note on the right around SMART goals. And we talked through SMART goals last week. And so that is hopefully something that's really familiar to you at this point in time. And again, if you missed that session, it is recorded and we can send you the PowerPoint for your reference. And so, oh, look, I was way ahead of myself. When I talked about walking out of that strategic planning session, after you walk out of there, you're compiling all that information. So you see the notes from your flip chart paper, your written notes, post-its, verbal comments, all of the things that come out of that session. Create the draft, send it out for feedback, incorporate their feedback, and then, of course, whatever your bylaws or operational guidelines or your coalition or committee or organization has agreed on in order to codify or formalize the plan. So in a lot of entities, that does require a vote, very normal. Or if you're okay with an informal consensus. One of the things that can really save you the trouble at the end of the process is this hint you see on the left, is really allowing input from everyone in the beginning. And so it's almost the planning to plan phase. So if you go through this whole process and you've left out a key stakeholder, and that stakeholder maybe sits on your board and has a voting right, they may not approve a strategic plan they didn't participate in. And I know that that sounds simple or even obvious, but I cannot tell you how often this happens. Because we think we have everyone involved, or, oh yeah, Susan talked to them and, I think everything's okay, but I didn't talk with them directly, so I don't really know. Those types of communication breakdowns can really be detrimental to the success of the strategic planning process. So it is very important that in advance you identify who the stakeholders are to the strategic planning process. If they're not able to participate in person, that you get their feedback, you go to coffee with them, you talk with them on the phone, you send them a survey to fill out, whatever it is, but you allow them some way to inform the process. And then while you're sitting in the strategic planning session, part of that kind of orientation process or whatever it may be, maybe you hand out the absent members' comments to the entire group so that everyone has a copy of it. Or, if we're talking about underage drinking and Susan, who's, on the board and not present today, had some really good ideas around underage drinking, that when you get to the underage drinking part of strategic planning, pull out Susan's comments and, read them to the group so the team can consider them, but make it an active part of the strategic planning process. So again, you don't get to all the way to the end and Susan's like, what happened to that 10-page document I sent over with all of these recommendations? You haven't included a single one of them, because that will kick you in a very painful place at the very end of a process that you really don't want to go down that road. And hopefully you have avoided that by learning your lesson today. And so the other component that is really integral around strategic planning is that the document is a living document. And so as you continue to conduct your activities and learn and grow, and again, maybe you engage Mrs. Ruggles and she is like, you were my worst student I've ever had in my 40-year career. Of course I'm not going to help you. Then you need to be able to bring back the strategic plan and say, okay, Mrs. Ruggles didn't work. What other, big corporation or company in town would be willing to help sponsor this program? And maybe you identify a new stakeholder. There's lots of different ways, to reassess your strategic plan. But the point is that it's a living, breathing document that you really want to use. When I have ran coalitions and organizations, our strategic plan got looked at every single meeting. We met monthly, sometimes every 2 weeks. But every monthly meeting, when the entire coalition was together, the strategic plan was in hard copy in front of everyone. And, we went down the list and said, hey, where are we at with this? What's the progress on this? How are we doing here? Do we need some more support? Do I need to make a phone call? What can we do to help move this process forward? And maybe someone, 3 months in, we're like, this strategy is really not working. We need to reassess it. Awesome. We'll set up an ad hoc meeting with, a committee centered around this. And, you guys can come up with a new plan and propose it at next month's meeting. And so it becomes, a routine part. It also, it informs your coalition structure. So like I just said, if we're doing education and marketing, maybe we need a work group that is focused on creating messaging, looking at, evidence-based practices for prevention marketing programs, but allowing the strategic plan to inform your structure. I know I've talked about this in the last couple of weeks, but if you have not revisited your coalition structure in the last 5 years, it's probably time to do that. I definitely recommend, if you're doing your strategic plan every year, that you revisit your structure every year, because your strategic plan should inform the way that you are positioned. And the perfect example of this is that when you're in your needs assessment year, of course you're going to need work groups centered around data collection and research and organizing focus groups and engaging survey participants and reading empirical literature and writing. Maybe have a writing team that pulls all this information together. But once your needs assessment is done, and you're focusing on strategic planning and implementation, you don't really need a research committee anymore, unless that has somehow become a part of your strategies for the year, for your implementation of goals. So you really want to remain agile as a coalition and constantly reinvent your structure. It helps keep people engaged. It helps bring on new talent, and it specifically aligns your resources, your capacity, with your existing and current needs. And I already talked about having your strategic plan as a part of your coalition meeting at every meeting. And so with our last 2 minutes, we are actually at the close of our session for today, but I wanted to provide an opportunity for folks to type in any questions you have. We didn't get a chance for questions last time, so I want to make sure that we do that. And then I will make a public service announcement while you type any questions that you have. In order to receive credit for attending today, not only do we appreciate you sharing your attendance in the chat box, but in order to receive credit for today, we do ask and need you to fill out the survey that you see here in this link. And if you scroll all the way to the very top of the chat box, you will see the link again, and I'm actually going to type it in there for you and send it. There it is. So go online and fill out that survey real fast, and that way Lorraine and the team will know that you were here, so you can get your certificate of completion. Of course, my contact information is down here at the bottom. That's my email address, as well as my cell phone number, so you can reach me at that number at any time via text message, or again, call me, email me with any resources that you need. And I believe if she has not already, or if they have not already, that Lorraine or Chucks will be sending out a PDF of this presentation, as well as that handout that I described earlier around environmental strategy. So please make sure that you receive that, because it's really helpful. I don't see any questions in the chat box, and so I'll hang out for another minute or so. But otherwise, you are all free to go. Thank you guys so much for participating, and I look forward to seeing you next time.